The day Martha Fletcher arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she carried nothing but a carpet-bag, a silence that had lasted 3 years, and a grief so heavy it had reshaped the way she walked, careful and deliberate, as though the ground itself might give way beneath her feet without warning. She stepped off the westbound stage with the kind of composure that fooled most people. Her dress was dark blue, the color of a sky that had not quite decided to storm, and her hair was pinned so tightly at the nape of her neck that the women who watched from the boardwalk thought she was severe. They were wrong. The pins were there because loose hair reminded her of the night she had run from the fire, hair streaming behind her, and she could not afford to be reminded of that night any more than she was already reminded of it every single time she closed her eyes. Caldwell in 1879 was not a gentle town. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a boot propped on a fence rail, rough, weathered, and unapologetic. Cattle drives came through and left behind a particular kind of noise and a particular kind of smell, and the town had grown up around both. There were saloons that never completely went dark, a general store owned by a man named Prout who charged too much and smiled too little, a barbershop, a land office, 2 churches that disliked each other on matters of theology, and a boarding house run by a widow named Agnes Crane who had opinions about everything and kept them all vocal. Martha had written ahead. She had a room reserved at Agnes's boarding house, and she had arranged through a letter sent 3 weeks prior to inquire about the position of schoolteacher, since the town had been without one since Christmas when their previous teacher, a young man from Ohio, had decided that Kansas winters were not worth the $40 a month the town council offered. Martha was 31 years old, and she had been a schoolteacher before. Before she was a wife, she had taught in a little schoolhouse in Missouri. Then she had married Thomas Fletcher, who was warm and laughing, and who had built her a house with his own hands, plank by plank and nail by nail, through one long Missouri summer. He had built it so well that she had believed it would stand forever. She had called it home the very first night she slept in it, and Thomas had laughed his big rolling laugh and said, "Well, it better be, because I am not building another one." The fire had come in March of 1876. A lamp knocked over by the wind when a window had been left open, the way people always said it could not happen, but it could, and it did. Thomas had not made it out. Martha had barely, because Thomas had pushed her through the bedroom window before the roof came down, and she had lain in the frozen mud of their yard and watched everything burn and had not made a sound. Not one sound. Not that night, not for weeks after, not for months. She had stayed in Missouri for a year after, living with Thomas's sister, Ellen, who was kind but could not stop looking at Martha with an expression that was equal parts pity and helplessness. And that expression, after 12 months of it, had become its own kind of pain. So Martha had written to the land offices and the school boards and the newspaper listings from one end of the frontier to the other, and eventually Caldwell had written back. She had packed her carpet-bag, she had said goodbye to Ellen, she had not cried, she had not said the word home since the fire, not once. Not in any letter, not in any conversation, not in any quiet moment alone. The word had belonged to Thomas and to the house he built, and she had left it in the ashes along with everything else. Agnes Crane met her at the door of the boarding house with a cup of coffee and a frank assessment that took approximately 4 seconds. Agnes was 53, built like a woman who had spent decades not needing anyone's help with anything, and she had small dark eyes that missed nothing. "You are thinner than your letter suggested," Agnes said, which was not something Martha had suggested in her letter at all, but she understood that Agnes simply meant to observe and not to wound. "I am fine," Martha said, and Agnes nodded once as if to say, "We will see about that," and stepped aside to let her in. The room was small and clean. There was a narrow bed, a window that looked onto the main street, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. Martha set her carpetbag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she washed her face, repinned her hair, and went back downstairs to ask Agnes where she could find the school board chairman. His name was Bernard Haley, and he sat behind a desk in the land office and shook her hand with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been trying to fill a position for 4 months and was very tired of trying. He hired her on the spot. The schoolhouse was at the west end of town. She could start Monday. There were 14 students ranging from 6 years old to 15. She was welcome to discipline as she saw fit so long as she did not use the leather strap, which the previous teacher had used too freely and which had caused a protest from 3 families. Martha said she had no intention of using a leather strap on anyone. Haley looked so relieved she almost smiled. She spent Friday and Saturday settling in, walking the town, introducing herself to the few people who introduced themselves first. On Saturday afternoon, she walked out along the western road past the edge of town because she had developed a habit, in the years since Thomas died, of walking until the land opened up and she could see the sky from one edge to the other, because the sky was the one thing that never reminded her of him. It was on this walk, about a mile outside of Caldwell, that she first saw Milton Hunter's ranch. It was not the biggest ranch she had ever seen, but it was the most deliberate. The fence lines were clean and straight, the kind that took patience and care. The barn was new enough that the wood had not yet gone gray, and it sat at a confident angle to the main house. The house itself was low and wide with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and there were 2 rocking chairs on the porch and a dog asleep between them, orange and enormous, like a small mountain range. The man was on the porch too, though she had not noticed him at first because he was very still, leaning with his arms on the porch railing, looking out at the same western horizon she had been walking toward. He was tall. She could see that even from the road, and he wore a dark hat pushed back on his head and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was not doing anything. He was just looking the way she had been walking because you needed to. He noticed her a moment after she noticed him, and he straightened and touched the brim of his hat, which was how men greeted women they did not know in this part of the country, and Martha gave a small nod in return and kept walking. She found out his name from Agnes that evening at supper. Milton Hunter, Agnes said, passing the biscuits. Runs cattle, some horses. Been here about 5 years. Came from Texas originally. Quiet man. Keeps to himself, which some people take for rudeness but I think is just his nature. She paused. He is 34 and unmarried before you ask. I was not going to ask, Martha said. I know, Agnes said pleasantly, and changed the subject. Martha thought about the porch for a moment and then put it away and thought about Monday's lessons instead. She was good at her work. She had always been good at it, the way some people are good at things that require both intelligence and patience together, and the children of Caldwell were not so different from the children of Missouri. They were loud and easily distracted, and beneath that, genuinely curious about the world, which was all you really needed. By the end of her first week, she knew all 14 names without looking at her list, knew which children were struggling with arithmetic, and which ones were only pretending to struggle because the struggle got them attention, knew which ones were being kept home some days to help with planting or younger siblings. The town warmed to her slowly, which she preferred. She was not performing warmth herself, so she did not expect it instantly from others. Agnes liked her in a direct and practical way. Bernard Haley nodded at her importantly whenever he passed her on the street. The woman who ran the dressmakers, a small French-Canadian woman named Odette, invited her to look at fabrics even though Martha said she had no money for new fabric just yet. And Odette said she could look for free, and the looking itself turned into a conversation that lasted an hour and left Martha feeling lighter than she had in some time. She saw Milton Hunter twice in those first 2 weeks, and both times it was at a distance. Once in front of Prute's store, loading sacks onto a wagon, moving with the easy, unhurried efficiency of a man who has done physical work his whole life and does not think about it anymore. once at the far end of the main street as she was coming out of the post office with a letter from Ellen, and he was on horseback, a dark bay horse, riding south, and he did not see her that time. The third time he spoke to her. It was a Wednesday in late April, warm enough finally that the mud had hardened into ruts and the cottonwoods along the creek at the edge of town had opened their leaves. She was walking back from the schoolhouse with a stack of primer books that needed mending, and she had stopped at the corner of the main street to shift the stack in her arms because it was heavier than she had planned, and she was calculating whether she could make it another 3 blocks or whether she needed to set everything down and rest for a moment. "Those look like they weigh more than you expected," said a voice, and she looked up. He had come out of the barber shop, she thought, because there was still a little pale dust of talcum on the shoulder of his coat, and his dark hair was freshly cut. Up close, his face was what she would call serious, not unkind, but not given to easy expression either. He had gray eyes which surprised her and lines at their corners from squinting at the Kansas sun. He was looking at her stack of books with a practical consideration that was not pity. "They do," she said. She did not pretend otherwise because pretending was more effort than it was worth. "I could carry those for you," he said, "if you are heading the same direction." "I am heading to Agnes Crane's boarding house." He nodded. "That is the same direction." He held out his hands, and she hesitated for only a second before she transferred the stack because her arms were genuinely aching. He tucked them under one arm with the calm of a man accustomed to awkward loads, and they walked. He did not talk constantly, which she appreciated. He asked if she had settled in all right, and she said yes, and he said the schoolhouse had needed a teacher for long enough that it was a relief to everyone she had come. She said she was glad for the work. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "Are you the man with the ranch on the western road?" She asked, though she already knew the answer, because it seemed strange to walk beside someone without acknowledging that you had already noticed them. "I am," he said. "You walked past last Saturday. I walk out there sometimes. The horizon is clearer past the edge of town." He looked at her sideways, not intrusively, more like he was simply registering what she had said and finding it comprehensible. "It is," he agreed. They reached Agnes's boarding house. He handed the books back. She thanked him, and he touched his hat brim the way he had from across the road that first day and said good evening and walked back the way they had come. Agnes was watching from the parlor window, which Martha did not know until she came inside and saw the particular shape of Agnes's not saying anything expression. "He is a decent man," Agnes said, over the sound of her knitting needles. "Was helpful," Martha said, and went upstairs. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them, and Martha found that rhythm easier to live inside than she had expected. She taught 5 days a week. She mended the primers and purchased, with some of her first month's salary, a proper reader for the older students who had been sharing a single copy between 6 of them. She took her meals at Agnes's table, and gradually those meals became conversations rather than just the polite exchange of information. Agnes, it turned out, had come to Kansas from Pennsylvania 20 years ago with a husband who had died of cholera 6 years later, and she had simply stayed because she had nowhere better to be, and had eventually turned that into something she called a life, which she said with a dryness that meant she had made her peace with it. Martha understood that particular kind of peace. She and Milton Hunter encountered each other again at Pruett's store in the first week of May, where she was buying ink and he was buying rope and a tin of coffee. The store was small, and they ended up standing near each other at the counter, and Pruitt was occupied with a dispute at the other end about the price of salt pork, so they waited. "How are the students?" Milton asked. He had remembered she was the school teacher. She noticed that he remembered things people mentioned. 14 of them, she said. Sharp kids on the whole. "The Devereux boy has a gift for mathematics that we are not remotely equipped to challenge, and I have been writing to the county office about whether there is any way to get him more advanced materials." He listened to this with genuine attention. "His father works for me some days," he said. "Jeb Devereux." I will mention to him that the boy ought to keep up with school. I would appreciate that. Jeb keeps the boy home some Thursdays. I will talk to him, Milton said, in the tone of a man who meant what he said and did not make a production of meaning it. The rope was measured out and cut. The coffee tin was wrapped. He paid and stepped aside to let her conclude her business with Prout, and as he was leaving he turned at the door and said, "If you ever walk out past the Western Road again in the evenings, I sometimes have coffee on the porch. You are welcome to it." It was offered with the same plainness with which he did everything, and there was no performance in it. It was simply that there was coffee and a porch, and he did not mind company. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left. She did not go the following week. She thought about it, and then she thought about Thomas and the porch of the house he had built, the specific feeling of sitting on that porch in the evening with the fireflies coming up from the grass, and the thought drew blood the way it always did, quietly and deeply, and so she stayed in her room at Agnes's and read. But the week after that, on a Thursday evening when the sky was doing something extraordinary, going orange, and then pink, and then a deep bruised purple in a way that felt almost like a deliberate performance, she found herself walking west out of town without having decided to. And when she reached the long fence of the Hunter ranch and saw the porch light and the two rocking chairs and the dog in its usual position between them, and saw Milton sitting in the left chair with a cup in his hands and his long legs stretched out, she turned up the path without quite deciding that either. He saw her coming and did not make a show of it. He simply stood, went inside for perhaps 30 seconds and came back with a second cup of coffee which he set on the porch rail. He sat back down. She came up the porch steps and took the coffee and stood at the railing and looked at the sky with him because the sky was still doing remarkable things and it seemed like the right thing to do. "I forgot how big it gets out here," she said eventually. She had been in Kansas 6 weeks. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "Missouri most recently." "Before that farther east." "What made you come west?" She considered how much to say. "The east was behind me," she said. "I needed something in front." He was quiet a moment. "I understand that," he said. She believed that he did. She sat in the right rocking chair and the dog opened one enormous amber eye and looked at her with ancient dignity and then closed it again. "What is the dog's name?" she asked. "Corporal," he said. "Why Corporal?" "When I found him he was about 10 weeks old and had already organized the other dogs on the property into a clear hierarchy in which he was in command. It seemed appropriate." Martha laughed. It was a small laugh, caught partway out, the kind that surprised the person producing it, and she put her hand briefly over her mouth, and then lowered it because there was no reason to hide it. She had not laughed easily in 3 years. It felt like using a muscle she had forgotten she had. Milton smiled. It transformed his face, not dramatically, but like a door opening in a wall you had thought was solid. She stayed for an hour. They talked about the cattle market and the railroad coming through and the upcoming spring fair the town held every year. And she asked about his horses, and he told her about them with a specificity and fondness that made it clear they were, in some way she respected, the thing he cared about most in the world. She asked how he had come to Texas from wherever he had been before, and he said he had been in Virginia, which surprised her, and she said she would not have guessed that, and he smiled again and said most people didn't. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, and she said thank you for the coffee, and he said she was welcome to come back whenever she felt like it. And there was nothing in his manner that made the invitation feel like anything other than exactly what it was, the simple and genuine offer of a quiet place and good coffee to someone who might need both. She walked back to town in the dark with the stars coming out overhead and the smell of grass and cattle on the warm air, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was adjacent to settled. It became a Thursday evening habit, and then sometimes a Sunday afternoon as well, and the dog Corporal eventually allowed her to scratch behind his ears, which Milton said was a higher honor than the dog had extended to most visitors in his 5 years of living on the property. She learned things about Milton Hunter, the way you learn them from a person who does not offer information all at once, but lets it come out in the natural way of conversation. He had grown up in a large family in Virginia with 3 brothers and 2 sisters, all still living, most of them scattered. He had come west after the war. He had been 17 when the war ended, too young to have fought but old enough to have watched it take the shape of the world he had grown up in and change it beyond recognition. He had gone to Texas in 1868, worked on cattle drives for 4 years, saved every dollar he earned, and come to Kansas in 1874 to buy land. He had built the house and barn himself over 2 seasons. He had made a reasonable success of the cattle operation and an unreasonable success of his horse breeding, because it turned out he had a natural understanding of horses that translated into something people in the territory were willing to pay well for. He had never married. She did not ask why directly, but he offered it obliquely one evening in June when she asked if he had ever thought about adding a second barn, and he said he had, but that a second barn was the kind of project that made more sense with a larger household, and that he had been a household of one for long enough that he had stopped planning around changes to it. She felt the weight of that admission, the particular loneliness contained in it, and she understood it so completely that she did not reach for a comforting response, because he was not asking for comfort. He was just telling her the truth. She told him about Thomas on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of June when the heat had come in hard, and they were sitting on the porch with the shade falling across them, and a jug of water on the rail between them because it was too warm for coffee. She had not planned to tell him. She had told very few people the full account of it. Agnes knew the basics. Odette knew the barest outline. Ellen, of course, knew all of it. But Milton was asking her something about Missouri, something about what the land was like there compared to here, and she was describing the farmland, and without understanding entirely how it happened, she was describing the house Thomas had built, and then she was describing the fire. She told it without flinching, in plain language, the way she had learned to contain it, not because the feeling was gone, but because the feeling was too large to let out all at once without it becoming unmanageable, and she had learned that the management of it was the thing that allowed her to continue. She told him about the window. She told him about the mud. She told him that she had not gone back to the site afterward because there was no reason to, and that she had eventually given the land to Thomas's sister who had sold it and used the money to make repairs on her own place. Milton listened the way he listened to everything, entirely and without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that was not awkward but full, the way the air is full before a storm. "I am sorry," he said. He said it without any of the performance that people sometimes attach to condolences, no reaching for words that would reach back as proof of sympathy. He just said it, and it was real. "Thank you," she said. She looked at the yard, at the fence lines running straight and clean to the horizon. "He built very well," she said. "I used to think that because he built it so well it would stand forever. I had not understood that careful building does not protect against everything." "No," Milton said quietly. "It does not." Something passed between them in that quiet that was not romantic, not yet, but was intimate in the way that genuine understanding between two people always is. She felt less alone sitting on that porch than she had felt anywhere in 3 years. She went home to Agnes's that evening and lay on her narrow bed and thought about what had happened and tried to be honest with herself about what she was feeling, because dishonesty with oneself was, in her experience, an expensive habit that always eventually collected its debt. What she felt was that she wanted to go back to that porch. Not for the coffee or even for the conversation specifically, but for the particular feeling of being in that space with that particular person, which was a feeling she had not expected to have again and was not entirely sure what to do with. She went back the following Thursday as usual, and the Thursday after that, and the month of July passed in the way that good months pass when you are not quite aware of how valuable they are, quickly and generously, full of heat and grasshoppers and long evenings, and the smell of honeysuckle coming in off the fields. She and Milton fell into the easy conversational fluency of people who have discovered they are genuinely interested in each other's thinking, and there was something underneath that fluency that neither of them named yet, a warmth that was growing the way warmth grows when you are not watching it, slowly and certainly. The town noticed, because towns notice everything. Agnes mentioned it with the neutral tone of someone who has already decided her opinion but is waiting for evidence to present it. Odette said, with great Gallic directness, that Milton Hunter was a man worth noticing, and that it was clear he had already noticed Martha. Bernard Haley said nothing, which in his case meant he was respecting the matter as private, which Martha appreciated. The women at the church. She had begun attending the smaller of the two churches, drawn by its quieter theology, treated it with a mixture of curiosity and the particular fondness small communities extend toward a romance happening within them. Martha did not call it a romance. She called it a friendship, even to herself, for as long as she could hold that word, which was until the last week of July. They had walked that evening. It was something they had started doing, leaving the porch after the coffee and walking out toward the creek that ran along the southern edge of his property, where the willows came down and the water was clear and cold even in summer. Corporal came with them, moving ahead at the imperial pace of a dog who has decided the general direction and will wait for the humans to keep up. They were coming back from the creek, the light failing behind them, the first fireflies coming up from the grass in a way that caught at something in Martha's chest before she could stop it, because fireflies had been the thing about those Missouri evenings she had loved most. She stopped walking. Milton stopped a half step after her and looked at her face in the dim light. "They came up like this in Missouri," she said, "in the evenings." "They do everywhere, I think," he said. He was not dismissing what she meant. He was acknowledging it. "Yes," she said. They stood there in the grass with the light going gold around them and the fireflies rising, and without planning it or deciding it, she put her hand on his arm, not taking hold, just resting it there the way you reach for something solid when the ground feels uncertain. He did not move. He let her hand be there, and after a moment he put his hand over hers, and they stood like that in the warm dark until the fireflies had risen as high as they were going to go, and the sky above them had gone fully to stars. She did not call it friendship after that. August brought a complication, as August in a cattle town often did. A man came through Caldwell with the cattle drive, a drover named Cole Langley, who apparently had some acquaintance with Milton from the Texas years, the nature of which was not immediately clear. He was the kind of handsome that knows it, with a wide white smile and an easy confidence that filled rooms and occasionally emptied them, depending on the room. He turned up at Agnes's boarding house one afternoon looking for Martha, which surprised her considerably since she had never met the man, and said he had heard she and Milton Hunter were friendly, and that he had a message for Hunter from down south about a horse he might be interested in buying, and would she pass it along. Martha said she would deliver no messages for strangers, and that if he had business with Milton Hunter, he knew where the ranch was. Langley smiled with the smile and said he just thought it would be a pleasure to have a reason to talk to her, which was so transparent that it was almost charming in the way that transparent things sometimes are. She told Milton about it that Thursday, matter-of-factly, because it seemed like information he ought to have. Milton's jaw tightened in the way she had learned meant he was working to keep his expression neutral. "Cole Langley," he said, "you know him. I worked with him for 2 seasons in Texas. He is a capable drover and a poor judge of what belongs to other people." That was all he said on the subject, and Martha did not press, but Langley's appearance in Caldwell lasted about a week. The cattle drive moved on and took him with it, and during that week Milton came into town twice without particular errand and walked with her back from the schoolhouse, which he had not done before. He was not possessive about it. He simply appeared. She understood that he was nearby, and she found that she wanted him to be nearby, and she did not pretend otherwise. When Langley was gone, the walking to and from the schoolhouse continued. Not every day, but often enough that the children began to arrive for school in the morning with knowing looks that Martha chose not to acknowledge, because 7-year-olds with knowing looks are one of the minor trials of the teaching profession. September came with a coolness in the mornings that smelled like the world preparing itself for something. The days were still warm, but the light was different, lower and more golden, and the prairies went bronze and amber, and the cattle on Milton's land grew their winter coats early, which he said meant the cold season would come in hard. He asked her to come to the fall fair with him, on a morning when they were both at Prout's store again, and he came out the door as she was going in, and he asked it so directly and with such evident sincerity that she said yes before she had thought about whether to, and then was glad she had. The Caldwell Fall Fair was, by 1879, a modest but genuine institution. There were livestock competitions, which Milton had entries in 2 horses and a steer, and there were pie competitions that Agnes entered every year and placed 3rd in every year, to the enduring bafflement of no one, because Agnes's pies were consistently and bafflingly average despite her confidence in them. There were horse races and shooting competitions, and a fiddle player who came every year from Wichita and whose playing by 10 o'clock in the evening had people dancing in the square. Martha went to the fair with Milton and discovered that it was different to be at a public occasion with a person you cared about than to be at one alone. She had been good at alone. She had learned all its techniques. But beside Milton, the fair was brighter, funnier, more interesting. She saw things through the fact of his presence that she would not have seen by herself. The way his face changed when he watched his best mare win her class. The quiet pride, not in himself but in the animal, in the years of careful work. He looked at the mare the way certain people look at things they have helped to become what they are, with a wondering satisfaction. She put her arm through his without thinking about it as they walked to watch the race, and he looked down at her with his gray eyes in the afternoon light, and she looked up at him, and the moment held for just a fraction longer than a casual moment would. "Martha," he said quietly, in the way of a man about to say something considered. "Not yet," she said gently, because she could see what was coming and she needed a little more time to be sure of herself before it arrived. He nodded, a single nod, and said nothing else, and they watched the race. And in the evening when the fiddle was going and people were dancing, he asked her to dance, and she said yes to that too. And they danced with the easy, instinctive rhythm of people who move well together, which they did. And when the song ended, he kept hold of her hand a moment longer than the dance required, and she let him. October was the month she truly began to know what she wanted, because October was the month that Thomas's sister Ellen wrote. Ellen's letter was warm and full of news. She had a new baby, a boy, and her husband's crops had been fair, and near the end of it, as if afraid to put it at the beginning where it might be the first thing read, she had written, "I worry about you, Martha. I worry that you are very far away and that you are alone. I know you left because you needed to, but I hope that wherever you are you have found something that feels like a place for you. I hope you have found something that feels like home." Martha sat with the letter for a long time at the table in Agnes's kitchen, with the October wind going at the window and Agnes moving quietly around the kitchen behind her as if understanding that the table needed to be given privacy. Home. Ellen had written home. Martha had not said the word or written it since the fire. She had moved through spaces. She had occupied rooms. She had eaten and slept and worked in buildings, and she had described them as the boarding house or the schoolhouse or the ranch, but not as home, never as home, because home was the word Thomas had given his breath and labor to, and home was the word that had burned. She thought about the boarding house room upstairs with its narrow bed and its hook on the wall. She was grateful for it. It was not home. She thought about the schoolhouse with its 14 desks and its ink-stained floor and its big windows that let in the morning light in long slanted rectangles. She loved her work. It was not home. She thought about the porch. She thought about the two rocking chairs and the dog between them and the wide horizon to the west, and the coffee that was always hot, and the particular feeling of sitting there in the evenings with her whole body, at rest, in a way that bodies are at rest only when they feel they are where they belong. She pressed the letter flat on the table with both hands and breathed very carefully, because what she had just understood was enormous and she needed to be steady while she understood it. She wrote back to Ellen that evening and said, among other things, "I think I have found something. I am not ready to say what it is yet, but I think I have found it." The following Thursday she walked to the ranch, and Milton was on the porch as he usually was, and Corporal was in his usual place, and the coffee was on the rail. And when she came up the porch steps and took her coffee and turned to look at the view, she said, quietly and without completely thinking about it, "I feel like I am coming home when I come here." She heard herself say it. The word, home. She felt the breath leave her. She turned quickly, afraid of what she had said, and her eyes went wide with it, and she saw that Milton had his back turned. He had bent to pick up something from the porch boards, a tool he had left there earlier, and he was rising with his back still to her, and she could not tell if he had heard. She hoped he had not. She was not ready. It was too large. The word had just come out of her without permission, the first time in 3 years, and the enormity of that was pressing against her ribs. Milton straightened and turned, and his face was entirely as usual, open and serious and kind, and he said, "Agnes was asking me last week whether you would be interested in taking on the older children for an extra Latin session in the afternoons," and his tone was so completely unremarkable that she understood. He had heard, and he was pretending he had not. He was giving her the chance to say it again. She looked at him across the porch in the October evening light, this man who had understood in 2 seconds what she needed and had provided it without being asked, without making a moment of it, without requiring her to explain or justify or make herself vulnerable on a timeline that was not hers. "I think," she said carefully, "that I feel something when I come here that I have not felt anywhere in 3 years." He looked at her. His gray eyes were very direct and very steady, and there was warmth in them that he did not hide or contain. "I am glad," he said. "I have hoped you would." "I said a word just now," she said, "that I have not said since my husband died." He waited. "Home," she said. "I said it about this porch." He crossed the porch in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, and his hands were warm and rough from work and utterly steady, and he held hers in that same careful way he had in the grass with the fireflies, like he was holding something he understood the value of. "Martha," he said, and his voice was low and direct, "I have been in love with you since June. I am not going to pretend otherwise, and I have no intention of being unclear about it. But I will not rush you, and I will not ask you for anything you are not ready to give. You can come to this porch for the rest of your days and drink coffee and say nothing more, and I will be grateful for every evening of it." She looked at him for a long moment, at his serious face and the sincerity in it, and the care he had always taken with her from the very beginning, from the day he had helped her carry books and had not made it into something it was not, and she thought about Thomas with the whole of her heart. She did not leave him out or push him aside. She let him be there completely, all the love she had for him and all the grief, and she understood that loving Thomas and loving Milton were not in competition. Because the heart is not a fixed-size vessel that empties when it fills, it is more like the prairie she had been looking at all these months, larger than you initially supposed, capable of more. "I love you," she said. "I am not unclear about it either." He pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held there on the porch in the October evening with the sky going dark gold behind the fence lines, and she held him back, and Corporal lifted his enormous orange head, regarded them with profound dignity, and then lay back down. They were married in December of 1879, in the smaller of the 2 Caldwell churches, on a day that had a cold white sky but no wind, which in Kansas in December was about as cooperative as the weather got. Agnes cried, which she did not admit to. Odette altered Martha's best dress into something actually worthy of the occasion. The 14 students from the schoolhouse, or most of them, attended with their parents and sat in the pews with the barely contained energy of children at an event they have been told is important. Bernard Haley shook Milton's hand with the particular enthusiasm of a man who feels that a good civic development has occurred. The two churches, which ordinarily disagreed about almost everything, both sent their ministers, and the two ministers agreed about the ceremony if nothing else. Milton wore his dark jacket and a white shirt and stood at the front of the church with a stillness that was not nerves but simply his way. And when Martha came down the aisle in Odette's altered dress with her hair finally, for the first time in 3 years, unpinned and lying loose over her shoulders, he looked at her with an expression she had seen only once before, the expression he had worn watching his mare win at the fall fair, and it was the look of a man beholding something he had helped become what it was. With wondering satisfaction, she held his hands at the altar and said the words she meant to say, and he said his, and the minister pronounced them, and everyone in the church seemed to release a collective breath that suggested they had all been hoping for this and were glad it had arrived. They walked out of the church into the white December light, and the children threw dried flowers, which was all the flowers available in December in Kansas. Martha moved into the ranch house 2 days after the wedding. She had very little to move, the carpet bag she had arrived with, some books, the few additional things she had acquired in her months at Agnes's. The room upstairs at the boarding house had been pleasant, and she was grateful for it, and she was more than ready to leave it. The ranch house was low-ceilinged and warm with a proper fireplace in the sitting room and a kitchen that needed someone who wanted to use it. Milton had furnished it sparsely and practically, the way single men furnish spaces, everything necessary, nothing decorative, the walls bare and the windows uncurtained. He showed her through it on the first evening with the straightforward pragmatism of a man who knows his limits and is not defensive about them. "You can change whatever you like," he said. "It is your home now as much as it is mine." She stopped when he said it, home. He stopped too, realizing what he had said and to whom. She looked at the sitting room with its fireplace and its bare walls and its practical furniture, and she thought, yes. "I know," she said. She taught through the spring of 1880, finishing out the school year. And then at Agnes's recommendation, the school board hired a young man from Topeka named Gerald who had better qualifications than Martha in terms of formal training, though she privately thought he was less naturally suited to the work. She stayed through Gerald's first week to hand over what she had learned about each child, and Gerald turned out to be quite good with them, which gratified her more than it disappointed her. She was, by May of 1880, expecting her first child, which she had told Milton on a morning in April when the prairie grass was coming in green and thick, and the whole world smelled like rain. She had told him at breakfast, plain and direct, because she was plain and direct by nature. He had sat very still for a moment across the table from her, and then had stood up and come around the table and knelt beside her chair and taken her hands in his the same way he had on the porch, and pressed his forehead against her hands and breathed, just breathed, for a long moment, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and it filled her completely. "Good," he said finally, which was the understatement of everything, and she laughed, and he laughed too, and Corporal came in from the porch looking suspicious about the unusual sounds, and then accepted a biscuit from the table and went back out. Agnes received the news with the air of a woman who had seen this coming, and had simply been waiting for confirmation. Odette received it with an enthusiasm that suggested she had already been thinking about what she could sew. Bernard Haley congratulated Milton on the street with the gravity of a civic official witnessing a significant local event. The pregnancy went well, all things considered. The summer of 1880 was hot but manageable. Martha planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house and grew beans and squash and tomatoes, and spent the evenings on the porch, always the porch, the two rocking chairs, Corporal between them, while the light went down and the prairie insects sang. Milton was always near, not hovering, not anxious, but simply present in the easy, competent way of a man who has decided where he belongs and belongs there thoroughly. She sometimes talked to him about Thomas in the evenings, and he listened the way he always listened, without discomfort or jealousy, because he had understood from the beginning that Thomas was part of who she was, and that the love she had carried for Thomas was not a diminishment of what she had for him. She appreciated this more than she could clearly articulate. She tried to tell him once, and he said he understood completely, and that he simply wanted her to be whole, and that whole meant all of her history, and there was nothing in her history that he wished away. She thought sometimes that she had not known a man could be this way, and then she thought she had, because Thomas had been kind too in his different way, and the world contained more goodness than the worst days of it suggested. Their son was born in October of 1880, which meant he arrived with the same golden light that had defined every important thing in the past year of her life. He was born healthy and loud, and arrived with an opinion about his situation that he expressed without reservation. Milton was there the whole time in the next room, and when Agnes, who had come out to assist the doctor, brought the baby to him, he held his son with an absolute and terrified tenderness that Martha watched from the bed with tears going quietly down her face, because some things are too large for dryness. They named him Thomas Milton Hunter, and if Milton felt anything about the first name, he showed only that it was right, which it was, and that he was glad to give the boy a name that honored the people who had made his mother who she was. Thomas, they called him Tom to keep him distinct in conversation, grew into his first year at the pace that healthy, well-loved babies grow, which is simultaneously too fast and not fast enough. By Christmas of 1880, he was smiling at everyone who came near him, including Corporal, who regarded the baby with an expression that suggested he had decided that the small, loud new arrival was under his jurisdiction, and he took the responsibility seriously. The ranch went well through 1881. Milton's horse breeding operation had expanded, and he had hired 2 additional hands, a man named Santos Reyes, who was Mexican and extraordinarily skilled with horses, and a younger man named Eli, who was 17 and eager and learned quickly. Santos had been in Kansas for 6 years and had built a solid reputation among the ranchers in the area, and Milton had hired him specifically over 3 other candidates, because Santos spoke to the horses with a patience that was almost meditative, and the horses responded to it. It had not escaped Martha that there were men in Caldwell who were less willing to hire Santos because of where he was from, and she thought this was a particular kind of foolishness, that the frontier should have cured people of given how much the frontier depended on the labor and knowledge of people from everywhere. She said as much at the church women's meeting in the spring of 1881, which caused Mrs. Hartley to purse her lips and Mrs. Camden to nod vigorously and Agnes to look at the ceiling with the expression of a woman who has long since had this argument and is conserving her energy. Santos, for his part, was a quiet and private man who became, over the months of working on the ranch, a fixture at the supper table on Fridays, which Martha had established as the day she cooked for everyone, because it seemed to her that a household that ate together once a week was a better household than one that didn't. Santos brought news from the trail towns to the south, and told stories about the cattle drives of the early 1870s, with a wry specificity that made them vivid, and Eli hung on every word with the avid attention of someone who has not yet had enough experience to be jaded by any of it. By the summer of 1881, Tom was walking, or rather careening, around the house and yard with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet fully reckoned with gravity's terms and conditions. He had Milton's gray eyes and Martha's dark hair, and a personality that was entirely his own, loud and social and interested in everything. The kind of child who walked up to strangers and offered them objects he had picked up from the ground as though conferring great gifts. Corporal followed him everywhere with an air of responsibility that suggested the dog had taken on the role of bodyguard and was not finding it light work. Agnes came to supper some Fridays, which she had begun doing around Christmas and had continued because she said Martha's cooking was better than her own, and she had no shame about admitting it. She and Milton had developed a friendship that expressed itself largely through the exchange of opinions about local matters, both of them being people who had strong views and did not require agreement to enjoy a conversation. On a Friday evening in August of 1881, Agnes arrived for supper with news. The county school board had written to ask whether Martha Fletcher, now Hunter, would be willing to take a position as an assessor and advisor for the rural schools in the county, visiting the schoolhouses in the surrounding area and evaluating their needs and making recommendations to the board. It was a formal position, paid modestly, and required some travel but mostly in the county. Martha read the letter at the table while Tom sat in his high chair and disassembled a piece of cornbread with the systematic intensity of a very small scientist. "What do you think?" she asked Milton, not because she needed his permission, but because she wanted his opinion, which was different. "I think," he said, looking at Tom and then at her, "that you are better at teaching than anyone else I have met, and that you missing it has been its own kind of loss. And I think Santos and Eli and I can manage the house and Tom between us on the days you need to ride out." "Santos would be greatly offended at being asked to manage a household," Martha said. "Santos," Milton said, "already manages everything on this property more competently than anyone else. He would be fine." She wrote back to the county board and accepted. The assessor work suited her with a precision that felt like the world offering something back after what it had taken. She rode out on a small, reliable mare Milton had selected for her with typical care to the schoolhouses in the surrounding townships, and she found in them a great variety of situations, from a well-stocked schoolhouse with an excellent teacher near Sumner to a one-room building near the county line, where 12 children of all ages shared 3 primers and a teacher who was willing but overwhelmed. She wrote her reports with the same directness she brought to everything, and the county board found her difficult to dismiss because her arguments were factual and her recommendations were specific, and she was clearly right about all of them. She was, by the end of 1881, a recognized figure in the county's educational system, which was not something she had planned, and which pleased her in the way that useful things please people who care about usefulness. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was exactly as cold as Milton had predicted the previous year, though prediction and reality are 2 different experiences. The prairie went white, and the wind came across it without obstruction, and the temperatures dropped in January to a point that required the hands to take shifts through the night checking on the livestock. Milton did his share of the shifts without complaint, and Martha did hers wrapping up to her eyes and going out in the frozen dark to check on the horses, which she had learned well enough by now that she could assess their condition at a glance. There were 3 days in January where the snow was so heavy and the wind so sustained that no one went anywhere, and they were all in the house together, her and Milton and Tom, and because the bunkhouse was genuinely too cold to be safe, Santos and Eli as well, and the 5 of them and Corporal existed in the warm inside of the ranch house, while the world outside made its worst arguments, and Martha thought that this too was a version of home. This particular arrangement of people keeping each other warm, and she felt nothing but gratitude for it. By spring of 1882, she was expecting their second child, which she told Milton in March with the same directness she had told him the first time, and he responded with the same absolute stillness, followed by the same overwhelming tenderness, which made her think this was simply how he received large and important things, and she was glad she knew it. Santos, on receiving the news at Friday supper, said he would pray for an easy birth, which he said in Spanish first and then in English, and then looked at the ceiling as though he had said something more personal than he intended. Eli said, with the enthusiasm of 19, that this was the best news he had heard all month, which was high praise from Eli, who found most news genuinely good. Agnes, who had arrived at supper as usual and had been watching Martha's face for several weeks with her small, dark, knowing eyes, said, "I knew it in February," and poured herself more coffee. The second child arrived in November of 1882, another boy, healthy and decisive from the first moment. They named him Jonas, for Milton's father, and the name suited him immediately and completely. Jonas was quieter than Tom had been as a baby, more observing, with a way of watching the world from under his brows that made him look, Milton said, like a small judge considering evidence. Tom, at 2 years old, regarded his brother with a complex series of emotions that resolved over about 3 weeks into a proprietary affection. He frequently brought Jonas objects he had gathered from the yard, including once a stone that was really quite heavy, which Santos intercepted with great diplomatic skill. Milton's father had died in Virginia a decade before, and naming the boy Jonas was a way of honoring that, of bringing something of the people and places Milton had come from into the family they were making together. Martha understood the importance of that and was glad they had done it. The county board offered her, in the spring of 1883, a more senior position overseeing all rural education in 3 counties, with a salary that was actually respectful rather than merely present. It required 1 day a week in the county seat in Wichita, which was a ride of several hours, and she and Milton worked through the logistics of it together at the kitchen table with the same practical collaboration that had become the language of their marriage, and determined that it was manageable and that she should take it, and she did. She was known in Wichita as Mrs. Hunter, and the men on the county board sometimes looked at her with the particular expression of men who have expected someone different and are adjusting their expectations, and she let them adjust without making a performance of it, because the work was what mattered and she was there to do the work. She and Milton developed a habit in those years of talking through everything that happened in the evenings on the porch, which was still the center of their lives together in the way it had been before they were married. Tom and Jonas, as they grew, absorbed themselves in the porch evenings too. Tom draped over the railing watching the horses in the yard, Jonas sitting beside his father in the rocking chair, sharing it in the way that small children share their parents' chair, which is to say completely and without negotiation. Corporal died in the spring of 1884, which was a grief they all felt. He had been, by any calculation, an old dog when Martha had arrived, and his years had been full and well attended. They buried him at the edge of the yard near the fence he had patrolled for so long, and Tom, who was 3, cried with the whole-bodied completeness that children cry with, and Milton held his son while Tom cried and said all the right things in his steady, direct way. And then they were all quiet for a while, and Martha thought about how grief is never only about the thing you are grieving but also about everything else you have grieved, and that this was all right. It was part of how loss works, and they would be all right. They got a new dog in the summer of 1884, a sheepdog mix that Tom named Admiral with the logic of someone who had heard Corporal's story and was continuing the military tradition. Admiral was less regal than Corporal and more enthusiastic in all directions, and Jonas regarded Admiral with his habitual judicial expression, until Admiral sat on his foot and licked his ear simultaneously, at which point Jonas laughed so completely that everyone else did too. By 1885, the ranch had grown into something Milton had not entirely planned, but that felt inevitable in retrospect. He had 6 horses he bred and sold, a cattle operation that employed Santos and Eli and 2 additional hands on a permanent basis, and a reputation in the county as a man who ran straight and treated people fairly, which was the reputation he had always wanted more than any other. He had put a second room on the east side of the house when Jonas arrived, and now he was talking about a proper parlor addition that would give the house a more complete shape. Martha watched him draw the plans for the parlor addition on the kitchen table one January evening, with Tom looking on importantly, and Jonas asleep in his chair, having fallen asleep during supper with the radical efficiency of a 2-year-old, and she thought she did not know how to hold how grateful she was. It was not that her life had been restored. Thomas was still gone. The house in Missouri was still ash. Those years of grief were still part of her history and always would be. But what had grown out of that ground was its own thing, its own green and living thing, and she had not known it could grow until it did. "Milton," she said. He looked up from his plans. "I want you to know," she said, "that this is exactly what I hoped for when I did not know what to hope for." He looked at her for a moment across the table, across the plans and the sleeping child in the warm kitchen, with all of that steady gray-eyed warmth that was so essentially him. "So do I," he said. Tom looked between them with the evaluating gaze of a 4-year-old who senses significance and is trying to determine its exact nature, and then he pointed at his father's plans and said, "Is the parlor going to have a bigger window?" "Yes," Milton said. "Good," Tom said, satisfied, and looked at the plans again. Martha laughed and Milton laughed, and Jonas slept through all of it. The parlor was built in the spring of 1885, and it did have a bigger window, one that looked west over the prairie, the same direction the porch looked, and Martha put a bench seat in it, and that bench became one of the places she liked to read in the mornings while the house was coming to life around her. It had a view of the fence line and the rolling land beyond, and on clear days she could see the distant line that might be trees along a far creek. And in the evenings the light came in that window in the same golden way the October light had come in since the first autumn she was here. In the summer of 1886, she found out she was expecting again. This time she told Milton on the porch in the evening, because that was where the most important things between them had always happened, and he took her hand across the armrest between the rocking chairs and held it without saying anything for a long moment, and then said quietly, "3." "3," she said. "That is a good number," he said. "I think so too." The third child was a girl, and she arrived in February of 1887, in the particular cold of a Kansas February, loud and healthy, and with an expression from the very first that suggested she intended to have opinions. They named her Ellen Martha Hunter, Ellen for Thomas's sister who was still in Missouri, and whom Martha still wrote to every month without fail, and Martha for herself, because Milton said that the girl should have her mother's name in her, which was the kind of thing he said sometimes that caught her entirely by surprise and required her to look away for a moment so as not to be too obviously moved. Ellen wrote back when she received the letter about her namesake with a letter so full of joy it had smeared the ink in places. She said she was so glad. She said she would come to visit in the spring if the roads allowed. She did, in April of 1887, the first time Martha had seen her since leaving Missouri, and she stayed 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks she and Martha did a great deal of talking that they had not been able to do by letter, the kind of talking that requires presence and the particular safety of being together. Ellen saw everything: the house, the porch, the ranch, Milton, Tom, and Jonas, and the baby Ellen, who regarded her namesake with royal blankness, until Ellen made a face and then awarded her with a grin so wide and sudden that Ellen said, clapping her hand to her chest, that the girl was going to be something. On the last evening of Ellen's visit they sat on the porch together, the 3 of them, Martha and Ellen and Milton, while the children slept inside and Santos was at the bunkhouse and Admiral was somewhere in the yard doing his nightly rounds. The evening was warm and the sky was a long, quiet orange. Ellen looked at the view from the porch for a while and then said to both of them, "I am so glad. I was so worried for so long, but I am so glad." Martha looked at the fence lines and the orange sky and the familiar shape of the land she had come to know in all its seasons. "So am I," she said. Milton reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest, the same gesture, after all these years still the same gesture, steady and certain as anything she had ever known. Ellen's visit ended. She went back to Missouri. The spring of 1887 moved into summer, and the children grew, and the ranch went on, and the Friday suppers continued. And Agnes came when she could, though she was slower now and her knees troubled her. And Santos had been on the property so long he was as much a part of it as the fence lines. Eli had left 2 years earlier to start his own small operation near Wichita, and they got news of him occasionally through Santos, who had kept up the acquaintance. He had done well, had married a woman from one of the cattle families, was building up his herd. In the evenings, Martha sat on the porch. Not always with Milton. Sometimes he was still in the barn or the yard when she came out, and she sat alone with the evening and the view and the sound of the children's voices inside through the window. But it never felt like being alone in the way she had been alone before. It felt like a pause in the middle of something ongoing, a breath between one good thing and the next. When Milton came to the porch, she always knew the sound of his boots on the step, and she always turned toward it the way you turn toward something you have learned to count on. And he always brought coffee, even in the summer when it was too warm for it, because coffee on the porch in the evening was what they did, and neither of them had any reason to change it. Tom, at 6, had developed a passion for the horses that exceeded even his father's, which Milton found both gratifying and slightly alarming in the way that seeing your enthusiasms reflected in your children is always slightly alarming. He could name every horse on the property and their histories and their temperaments, and Santos had begun, with Milton's blessing, teaching him the basics of how to approach and read a horse, which Tom absorbed with a focus he brought to nothing else in his life. Jonas, at 4, was the reader of the family, which had surprised everyone and delighted Martha. He had a patience for sitting with words on a page that was far beyond most children his age. And Martha had begun teaching him his letters the previous winter, and he had taken to them with that judicial concentration of his, as though the alphabet were evidence he was evaluating, and he intended to get the case right. She thought that whatever Jonas became when he grew up, it would involve books, and she was glad the world had them for him. Ellen, at 1, who they had begun calling Ellie to spare confusion, was at the stage of development that her brothers recalled as a period of intensive property acquisition in which every object in the house was claimed and defended. She had a particular fondness for Milton's hat, which she had taken off his head on several occasions, with an expression of satisfaction that suggested she considered it rightfully hers. Milton let her keep it whenever she took it, which made Martha love him unreasonably. The spring fair of 1887 was the best one Martha could remember since her first, the year before they married. Tom was old enough to enter his first horse event, leading a pony in a halter class, which he did with a solemn concentration that made everyone in attendance feel the weight of the occasion. He placed second, which he accepted with great dignity, and then Santos told him second was an excellent result for a first time, and Tom nodded the way someone nods when they have decided to agree. Agnes won the pie competition that year. Finally, after 8 years of third place, she brought a blackberry pie that was so definitively better than the competition that the judge announced it with the surprise of someone who had been in a routine and suddenly found themselves outside of it. Agnes received the blue ribbon with an equanimity that suggested she had always known this would happen and had simply been waiting. Martha hugged her, and Agnes said, in a tone of deep self-justification, "I told you the blackberries were the answer. I told everyone." "You did," Martha agreed, "every year. And every year people said, 'Try the apple, try the peach,' as if I did not know my own blackberries." They walked back to where Milton and the children were waiting, and the afternoon was warm, and the town was full of the good-natured noise of a community enjoying itself, and Martha thought she had no idea any more what she would have been doing instead of this, which was the best sign she could imagine. In the autumn of 1887, something happened that brought a piece of Milton's history to the surface. A letter arrived from Virginia, from his eldest brother, Daniel, saying that their mother was ailing and that Daniel and the others thought Milton should know. Milton read it at the kitchen table with the face he wore when he was thinking through something large and difficult, and Martha sat across from him and waited. "She is 73, he said. "She has been strong her whole life. I did not think about her being less strong." "Do you want to go?" Martha asked. He looked at her. "It is a long way." "I know. Do you want to go?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think I should." They arranged it over the following week. Santos could manage the ranch. He had managed it before. During a few days, Milton had been away, and had done so entirely without incident. The children would stay with Agnes, who received this information with the air of someone who had been hoping to be needed and was glad of the opportunity. Martha made arrangements with the county board to delay her monthly Wichita visit by 2 weeks. They traveled east together. Milton had not suggested she stay behind, and she had not offered to. The train from Wichita to Kansas City, and then east, and the landscape changed around them as they went, greener and more enclosed, and Martha watched it from the window and felt the layers of the journey toward the east, toward what had been, toward the places that preceded where they both had come from. Virginia was green in October in a way Kansas was not, a deep certain green that came from older trees and more rain, and the Hunter family house was a white clapboard farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley that was, Martha could see, very old and very loved and very full of people. Daniel Hunter was much like Milton in the bones of his face, but louder in manner, with 2 children who immediately attached themselves to Tom and Jonas, with the efficiency of cousins who understand they are cousins without needing to be told. There were sisters and their husbands and more children, and the house, which had seemed large from the road, contracted immediately around all of them. Milton's mother was in the sitting room, smaller than Martha had imagined from how Milton had described her. A small, precise woman with white hair and gray eyes very like her son's, and an expression of great calm that was, Martha thought, the expression of someone who has made her peace with the shape of her life. She was ill, genuinely, with something in her lungs that the doctor said would not get better, but she was clear-minded and present, and when Milton came into the sitting room she held out her hands to him, and he took them and bent and kissed her forehead and stayed there a moment, and it was a thing Martha looked away from because it was private. She was introduced as Martha, Milton's wife. His mother held her hands and looked at her with those gray eyes for a moment and then said, in a voice that was quieter than it had been but still carried, "He wrote to me about you. He has written about you since last year." "He did not tell me that," Martha said. "No," his mother said with a small smile. "He would not have. He is careful with things that are important to him." Martha stayed for 10 days in Virginia. It was, in a way she had not anticipated, a revelation to see Milton in the context of where he had come from, to understand the specific shape of the family that had produced him, the loud and loving complexity of it. She could see where his steadiness came from, and where his quietness came from, and where his particular way of caring for things came from, and all of it made sense, and it was the most complete understanding she had ever had of a person. His mother improved slightly while they were there, enough to sit up at the supper table 2 evenings and receive all her family around her with the composure of someone who is aware they are being seen and does not want the seeing to be sad. She died the following spring, in April of 1888, which reached them by letter on a Monday morning, and Milton sat with it for the rest of the day in the way he sat with things that were too large to move through quickly. Martha was near him all day, not hovering, not talking, just near, in the way he had always been near her when she needed it. They planted a rose bush at the edge of the yard in his mother's memory, a deep red rose that Martha had found at the nursery in Wichita on one of her monthly visits. It grew through that spring and summer with a determination that was almost personal, and by fall it was tall enough to be seen from the porch, and in the mornings when the dew was on it, the red was very bright against the Kansas sky. Life continued, which is what life does. Tom turned 8 and Jonah's 6 and Ellie 3. Tom was reading well now under his mother's instruction, and Jonas was writing letters to his Aunt Ellen in Missouri and receiving letters back, which he kept in a box under his bed with the seriousness of a boy who understands that correspondence is a form of keeping things. Ellie remained in command of all she surveyed. Santos had been at the ranch for 6 years by 1887 and was as much a member of the household as anyone, though he maintained his own privacy with the dignity of a man who chooses what to share and considers that a reasonable exercise of sovereignty. He was, Martha knew, sending money south to family in Chihuahua, and he was, she thought, quietly homesick for something he had left long enough ago that he was no longer sure he could go back to it. She never said this directly because it was not hers to say, but she made sure, in all the ways available to her, that he knew he was valued. The new hands Milton had hired through the years came and went, as hands did, some staying a season and some staying longer. One young man, a Cheyenne man named Running Bear who went by Robert in the town and Running Bear on the ranch. He had been working cattle drives since he was old enough to ride, and had arrived one spring with Santos's recommendation and Milton's assessment of a man who understood horses as well as Santos himself, stayed for 3 years and was, during those 3 years, as reliable a member of the operation as anyone. When he left to go north, following his people's movements, Milton paid him a full month's wages over what was owed and shook his hand, and Running Bear looked at him with a directness that was its own kind of respect, and said the ranch was a fair place, and rode out. Martha thought about that assessment a fair place, and thought it was, among the various things that could be said about a ranch and the people who ran it, probably the best. There was a great deal of unfairness in the territory, and she had watched it over the years with the particular helpless frustration of someone who can see a wrong and cannot wholly correct it from where she stands. She had written, in her county board reports, about the children of Mexican families and the children of mixed-race families who were receiving less education or no education, and she had named it plainly, and she had made her recommendations, and some of them had been acted on and some had not, and she kept making them because the alternative was to stop making them, which was not an option she would take. Milton had been elected to the county commission in 1886, which he had not sought but had accepted with the pragmatism of a man who understands that civic responsibility is a thing the capable are obligated to carry. He sat on the commission 2 terms, and in those terms argued consistently for road improvements, for the expansion of the county school system, and for fair treatment of the various communities in the county, including the farmers and the cattle operators, who disagreed about most things, and the Mexican workers who the county had been inclined to overlook, and the few remaining indigenous families who had stayed in the area through the years of treaty and broken treaty and settlement. He was not always successful. He was often in the minority. He voted his position every time. Martha was proud of him in the way she was proud of everything he did, not loudly, but completely. By 1890, the Hunter Ranch was a well-established institution in Caldwell and the surrounding county. Milton was 45 and still moved with the same unhurried efficiency she had first noticed from the road, 10 years before. Tom was 9 and spent every hour Santos would give him in the horse barn. Jonas was 7 and had written a letter to the county school board, with Martha's oversight but in his own words, about the need for more books in the rural school near the county line, which the board had apparently found so impressive that Bernard Haley, now retired from his chairman position but still on the board, had read it aloud at the meeting. Ellie was 4 and had opinions about everything, and expressed them without hesitation, which Martha thought was her own nature reflected back, and which Milton found endlessly amusing. Agnes had slowed considerably by 1890, but continued to manage her boarding house with the assistance of a young woman she had hired, and continued to come to Friday supper as long as the weather allowed, and continued to have opinions about everything, which was the most Agnes thing possible, and which made Martha deeply glad. On a September evening in 1890, 11 years after Martha had arrived in Caldwell on the westbound stage with nothing but a carpetbag and a silence, she sat on the porch of the Hunter ranch in the evening light with Milton beside her, and the sounds of their children inside the house, and the roses at the edge of the yard still red in the late-season warmth, and she thought about the word, home. She had said it about this porch first, 11 years ago, caught herself, and he had pretended not to hear so she could say it again, and she had, and everything that had followed from that moment had been built on the foundation of that word, spoken in the October evening light to a man who had understood what it cost her and had made space for her to spend it. She said it now, quietly, to the evening. Home. Not catching herself, not surprised by it. Just naming what it was, what it had been for a long time, what it would continue to be. Milton turned to look at her. Yes, he said. She looked at him in the last of the light, at the face she had memorized over 11 years, every line, every expression, the particular set of his mouth when he was trying not to smile, and the way his eyes softened when he looked at the children, the slight furrow between his brows when he was thinking through a problem, the open, steady look he gave her specifically that meant, I am here, I see you, I am not going anywhere. I love you, she said. I love you, he said. The words were as plain and complete as everything between them had always been, and they sat with the evening coming down around them in the great Kansas quiet, with the prairie running west to the horizon and the fence lined straight and true, and the rosebush still red at the edge of the yard. And inside the house Tom and Jonas and Ellie made the usual sounds of children alive to the world they were growing up in, and it was all exactly what it was. Which was more than Martha Fletcher had thought she would ever have again on the night she had run from the fire and lain in the mud of her yard, and not made a sound. She reached out and put her hand over Milton's on the armrest between the rocking chairs, and he turned his hand and held hers. That was all. That was everything. The stars came out, one by one, as they always did, over the Kansas plain, and the ranch was quiet and warm and entirely, completely, wholly home.